Thank you for joining our webinar. We will be getting started in approximately 1 minute. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining our webinar, RadSite Standards and Accreditation Updates, 2021 Annual Update, and what to expect in 2022. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's presentation will be recorded, and an email containing the link will be sent to all registered participants by the end of the week. It will also be available through our website. To minimize noise and distraction, all attendee phones have been muted. However, if you have a question or comment during the presentation, we encourage you to submit it using the Q&A box on the lower right side of your webinar bar. We will also do our best to address all questions and comments at the end of the presentation. I will now turn the presentation over to our moderator, Garry Carneal, President and CEO.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm thrilled to be here today with you to give you an update, along with my colleagues, on some of the standards development activities and accreditation updates that we've been working on this past calendar year, and additional changes as we continue heading into 2021. Today, I'm joined by many of my colleagues. First, I'm Garry Carneal again. I'm President and CEO of RadSite. I've been in the position for about 10 years, and I've devoted most of my career to developing accreditation standards in healthcare. Over the past 25 years, I've brought 25 different accreditation programs to market. And one of the things that I'm reminded of is really how accreditation can really promote change within different healthcare segments and fields. The very first accreditation program that I brought to market was for PPOs back in the mid-1990s. We had moved from indemnity insurance to HMOs. No one knew what a point of service plan was, so I had the opportunity through the accreditation organization I work with to create national standards for that. And then most recently, for example, worked with the American Telemedicine Association to develop national standards for telemedicine, which really kind of identified some of the key workflows and different types of telehealth offerings. So today I'm also joined by, in order of presentation, Dr. Patrick Browning. He currently serves as the Chief Medical Officer for RadSite, and he serves as an invaluable resource to the committees and staff, leveraging his expertise. Among other accomplishments, he founded a imaging division within Sutter Health that really added some additional functionality to that health system. And he also most recently was the Chief Medical Officer from Magellan Health, so it's good to have his pair background as well. Next up, we have Mark Kassner, who is currently the chair of RadSite's Accreditation Committee. He's been serving in that role for over 5 years. And he has over 40 years of experience in the healthcare field. And Mark has had some really interesting jobs, including extensive experience running both fixed and mobile imaging systems in the United States. So he brings to RadSite a lot of on-the-ground expertise. Next, we have Phil Patton. Dr. Patton, actually next year will be celebrating his 10th year anniversary with RadSite as RadSite's Chief Physicist Officer. So we've been very fortunate to have him for the past decade to really help us develop some of the physics standards. He's the president CEO of LBT Radiation Physics Consulting, and he spent good chunks of his career developing kind of new methods for physics testing and was a professor at UNLV. Last but not least, on the presentation today, we have Julie Irons. She and I have worked together for over 20 years. She's our manager of accreditation, and many of you who work with, have applied for accreditation know of her. And she's been at RadSite, Julie, for how long? About 7, 8 years now, or 10 years? I'm losing track. And
yes, going on 8 years.
Yeah, good. So, but again, we've worked together for over 20 years with different accreditation agencies. You know, one of my favorite things also about RadSite is that we're dependent upon over 50 volunteers for our committee system. We have 2 standards committee, one for the traditional advanced diagnostic imaging accreditation program, and then another for the cone beam CT. We have an accreditation committee, and we have a board of managers. So we are able to leverage a lot of experts in the field, and it's really been a fantastic opportunity to work together. Excuse me. Today, we're going to really focus on a little bit of RadSite background, just some reminders in terms of the accreditation advantages, some of the ongoing research initiatives, obviously give you some standard updates with some focus particularly on a couple of key issues related to specialty modules for remote technologists, virtual accreditation audits, and cone beam CT physics. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ongoing accreditation tweaks that we're making to the system and future trends. So as many of you know, RadSite was established in 2005. Our initial solution was to really help payers and states. For example, we work with Humana, the state of New Jersey, to basically certify imaging suppliers or providers. During that first phase of RadSite, we actually certified over 60,000 imaging systems and 25,000 provider locations, really helping, for example, health plans create smart networks. And then we moved on and launched after about 3 or 4 years of development, the RadSite MIPPA accreditation program, which was approved by CMS in 2013. So we expanded our mission, and today we now offer 5 distinct accreditation programs that are approved by CMS and hundreds of payers related to advanced diagnostic imaging, one for CT, another one for MRI, another one for nuke med, including SPECT and PET, and then our 2 new accreditation programs, which we launched after 3 years of development this past spring for dental and medical cone beam CT, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So, I often, think about all the different advantages for accreditation. Obviously, for the MIPPA market, any imaging supplier has to apply if they want to get reimbursement for Medicare beneficiary that's getting scanned. But there's a lot more to it in terms of the accreditation tradition in the United States. This includes kind of general concepts of accountability and transparency. A lot of regulators and payers will use that kind of aspect of accreditation just as a assurance to supplement the regulatory process. One of the things I love about RadSite is the educational component, not only our ability to educate imaging suppliers and other stakeholders, but also for us to hear back from the companies we accredit so we learn as we go along. And the other thing is to really promote evidence-based clinical pathways and to not only work on process and structure measures, but performance measures, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And at the end of the day, really just to improve the business, the governance, risk management, overall workflows. So I think the accreditation experience, particularly through RadSite and leveraging kind of my quarter century of expertise and everybody else is on the webinar today, we're really able to create a positive experience that, I like to say that, in my career, I've accredited over 5,000 different healthcare organizations, and in every instance, they've made at least one change for the better. The part of our mission, though, is also to be research-based and make sure we're talking to other stakeholders. We're now in the 2nd year of an effort working with the National Alliance for Healthcare Purchasing Coalitions, for example. That's a group of employers that are kind of upstream to health plans, and we've been working with them in terms of national RFI to really first learn what payers are asking for in terms of key aspects of peer review, physics testing, cone beam CT, et cetera. We published actually an issue brief earlier this year, which you can download off our website or off the National Alliance website. But to me, it's a real privilege to work with thought leaders like this to really help kind of define how different stakeholders are looking at imaging, in this case related to key performance-based metrics. Another exciting initiative, which we're going to announce in the later this month, is a strategic alliance with RSNA, working with their Quantitative Image Biomarkers Alliance. RadSite is going to team up with RSNA to basically do a pilot looking at one of the biomarker profiles. In this case, it's FTG PET CTs that track lung cancer, to see if we can promote standardization from one imaging system to the next, obviously to create some more consistent feedback. So when it gets to the treatment of a patient, they know exactly whether the tumor or cancer is progressing or what's happening. So stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more going on with that. You'll hear over the next couple months. So these are just one of several examples, another example of things that we do. One of the trends that we've seen obviously is point of care imaging. And when we got into the advanced diagnostic imaging space, we were struck with over 30,000 dental cone beam CT systems being installed, and now a couple thousand on the medical side, that there really wasn't a whole lot of specific standards associated with cone beam CT imaging. It's growing, it's taking over the, certain aspects of the market and certain key subspecialties. Where in addition to dental, we're seeing it expand in, for example, ENT offices, orthopedic practices, podiatry, et cetera. So we started a 3-year effort to develop the standards, and we wrapped up that effort about a year ago and shared those standards with CMS at the very end of last year, beginning of last year, and then we finally got approval from them, and we launched the program in March and actually announced our first wave in September. And we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics of this program, but it's a great example of RadSite really trying to plug in some gaps, embracing the reality of what's going on in the marketplace and making sure we have standards that are more or less parallel to what we do for CT in this case. Although the acquisition technology is a little bit different, but it's much better to actually address this head on versus kind of hide our head in the sand, because in many, many instances, it's just the FDA approving the imaging system, but there's really no ongoing accreditation program or physics testing, for example. So we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward as we get into the details of the presentation. So as I said, we have 5 different accreditation programs. You can kind of download a integrated set of those standards off our website immediately. This is the table of contents. With each standard, you have an interpretive guide section. Typically, that includes details about further explanation about the standards and what you need to do to actually upload the documents. And one of the things I love about what RadSite has done through a lot of a good team effort is obviously we try to convert these standards into a pragmatic and realistic way through the accreditation portals. When you log in, we're asking you specific questions to kind of attest to the standards. But if you see the standards, we have a total of 7 different sections. The first section really deals with just the basic information about the applicant or the imaging supplier. Section 2 deals with specific details related to each applicable imaging system that's part of the review process. And sections 3 and 4 really get down to the job responsibilities of some of the key staff, which includes the medical director, clinical director, the interpreting physician or interpreting practitioner, the imaging technologist qualifications, the imaging manager functions, the role of the medical physicist, and the image safety officer. So this really provides, in addition to credentialing, kind of a framework of what type of positions are going to be staffed and who's going to fill them. We've also added a new kind of position over the past year or two, dealing with the concept of supervising physicians. So if it's a large imaging provider system, one medical director necessarily can't view all sites. So we have this concept of the supervising physician that may oversee one or more locations. And then we have a section on the policy and procedures related to key workflows, related to regulatory compliance, and just all the aspects, making sure you're documenting everything from the credentialing program to how images takes place, safety issues. And then we do have a standalone section, section 6, on quality and patient safety, that really deal with all the kind of the mainstream issues related to quality assurance, patient safety, basically access, confidentiality, and financial integrity. And then we have a significant section, section 7, which deals with the technical component, which is really made up of 2 aspects. Dr. Browning will be talking a little bit about the submission of images and reports that go through an evaluation through a third-party radiologist reviewer. And then Dr. Patton will be talking about the physics reports and phantoms that are submitted as part of the physics, part of the technical component. So going forward, I'm pleased to announce that RadSite will be actually developing a library of kind of short clips that kind of bring the different aspects of these standards to life beyond the webinar, for example, that we're offering today. So 2020 was a pretty significant year for us as we moved to version 3.0 to 3.1, where we basically adopted the specialty certifications, and Dr. Bryan is going to revisit that a little bit for us. It was really pretty a heavy lift to kind of create all those different subspecialty areas. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Then Mark Kassner is going to talk a little bit about kind of our development and use of remote technologists. Part of this was spurred on by the pandemic. So we're going to kind of highlight that. And then Dr. Patton's going to talk about kind of the emerging kind of pathway for Cone-beam CT physics testing, among other things. But in addition to those issues, we have been making some tweaks in the standards. And of course, you can always talk with us offline if you want a little bit more details. This will be upgraded and kind of formally adopted probably in January, February. So the traditional advanced diagnostic imaging standards will have version 3.2. And for the Cone-beam CT, we'll be moving from version 1.1 actually to 1.2. But along the way, we realized that, for example, not all clinical medical directors are actually doing interpretation. So we've kind of tweaked a little bit some of the training requirements that are maybe not so specific, assuming that they're also doing the reads. CMS has made some slight adjustments to the supervision requirements, particularly related to contrast. During the pandemic, there is the ability in a limited capacity to have the supervising physician be remote, but there are certain requirements for that. And then they've clarified the regulations, allowing some limited instances, like a nurse practitioner or physician assistant, to order some exams. So we can talk a little bit more about that if there's interest. And then we kind of queued up. We've always required the radiology technologists on site administering the contrast, for example, to have either BLS, ACLS, or ARLS certification. Obviously, ARLS would be for the physician. We are going to kind of go back, and if you're doing kind of any kind of remote supervision, we are going to require that the technologists administering the contrast have actually ACLS certification, which is a little bit more robust than the BLS certification requirements. And then there's been more kind of technical changes that we've made. We've kind of clarified the nuclear medicine collimator requirements to be a little bit more clear in the standards, for example. And we're continuing to work on many ongoing issues, including, for example, whether the NEMA XR 29 requirements would apply to Cone-beam CT. And as I'm sure many of you are aware, the NEMA requirements require kind of a DICOM compliant radiation dose structured reporting process. They require a dose check features, automated exposure control, and reference to specific adult and pediatric controls. And so actually CMS is exempted in the short term the Cone-beam CT, but that's an ongoing discussion we're having with CMS and some of the other accreditation bodies. And we're talking about also how do you quantify Cone-beam CT dose measurements, and really how do you move. Right now we require the physics to follow the manufacturer specification. So when we eventually move to version 2.0 down the road, we'll be looking towards a uniform standards and uniform phantoms, for example. So before I turn it over to Patrick Browning to kind of talk a little bit more about what he's going to chat about today, including specialty certification, I don't know if any of the other panelists had any comments about kind of what we've been up to in 2021 in terms of some of these tweaks. So here,
I think it's personally been a great process of sort of continual improvement, which is one of the things I really like about RadSite, is that we're continually striving to make things better for the clients and the patients.
Great. So Dr. Browning, why don't you go ahead and run with it with your section? Thank you.
Absolutely. No, thank you. One of the first things I'd like to express is the fact that it's really been an honor to be part of RadSite and to work with such a accomplished group of people, both in creating and maintaining standards and also improving how we do our business and what we do. And we'll see a little bit of that in a couple of slides. But overall, the other thing I think that's most impressive about RadSite is the fact that we're relatively granular without being overly comprehensive. And so the specialty modules actually have been very well received by facilities. I was initially wondering if they would feel it was a little bit too onerous, but they haven't really at all. One of the things that actually did change, because it was a little bit onerous, especially for facilities that were doing multiple different subspecialties, such as body imaging, breast imaging, potentially neuroradiology, PET CT, asking facilities to do 3 submissions for each specialty could add up pretty quickly. So we felt it was, especially for the well integrated and well run facilities, which are the ones we tend to actually see most of all, we felt we could decrease the number of studies down to 2 studies. Of course, the general study has to be included with the first 2 specialties, but after that, then just 2 specialty submissions, except for pediatrics, of course. And if 2% or more of their population is a pediatric population and they want to qualify for that, then they still have to submit 3. So I think that's been a good process of fine tuning. And I think this whole team has worked well to make sure that we're doing what we need to do in terms of making sure we're qualifying and making sure patient quality is there, but without going to the extreme lengths that some accrediting organizations go to. And you can see from the slide here that there are a large number of specialties that we do. Not every place does specialty certification for every single study, but I found that this has been very well accepted by both medical directors and personnel at different places. So that's my thoughts on that slide. If we go to the next one, I don't think I have it. There we go. Perfect. One of the things that has stayed pretty standard is on the right-hand side of our slide. You can see that the interpreting physician requirements, we had quite a lot of discussion about what's enough and what's too much, and certainly what's not enough. And I think we've landed in a very sweet spot. Again, there has not been, to my knowledge, Garry and Mark may know a little bit more, but to my knowledge, there has been really no complaining about the provider requirements for the standard CTMR in nuclear medicine. Everybody's been very accepting of it and felt like it was a good bar that they should make sure they achieve. The cone beam CT has been really interesting. As Garry said, cone beam CT initially was kind of a wild, wild west in some ways. There were a lot of manufacturers who made a lot of suppositions, and a lot of clinicians were using it for varying things. So I really feel like for the next year or 2 years, this is going to be an area where we're going to have a very large and very good positive patient impact in terms of making sure the quality is there, making sure the quantification of the unit is there, making sure that the imaging is coming up to standards. I really feel like that's going to be a very good part of what we're going to do over the next couple of years, including ensuring that the appropriate medical personnel are doing appropriate studies and that there isn't what I call imaging creep, where some subspecialties or some non-physician providers of imaging services might feel they're capable or should be able to provide interpretation of images that might be a little bit outside their scope of practice. One of the things I'm really happy about is that we've chosen to make sure that the different non-radiology specialties, which make excellent use of cone beam CT the vast majority of the time, don't get me wrong, but that they're sort of staying in their lane, if that makes sense. So the musculoskeletal imaging is done by orthopedists. That's great. They know what they're looking for. The foot and ankle imaging is done by podiatrists. That's great. They know what they're looking for. Dental, maxillofacial, done by their separate specialties. They are experts in those areas, and there's no reason they shouldn't be able to interpret those studies. However, if they start deciding they're going to do other imaging of other body parts, then we just want to make sure that they understand that that isn't their area of expertise, and it needs to be passed on to an MD or DO who's a radiologist for interpretation. And again, one of the things I found in the various visits, virtual and otherwise, and in conversation with clinicians has been, in many respects, they're sort of looking for guidance. One of the things that I'll touch on in the next slide is that RadSite's philosophy is not just to check boxes and not just to go on site and scare people and fail them and this, that, and the other. I mean, my personal goal, and I think that everybody else on this webinar's goal, is to work with the providers and the facilities to make sure they're providing the best care and the best imaging they can. And so the provider requirements for cone beam CT has been very well accepted. I think a lot of times people don't realize that they're a little bit out of their area of expertise, and they're happy to sort of be advised about how to better stay and provide better imaging for their area of expertise without sort of straying outside, if that makes sense. Of course, the CT and MRI, nuclear medicine, that's the standard MD or DO, typical radiology thing. And we, again, have had great success making sure that that has been well adhered to. One thing that I believe Mark will talk about is or Phil will talk about is the remote technologist concept, which is pretty new and gaining actually a lot of momentum. And then also the on-site supervision of any study requiring contrast. Pretty hot button topic. A lot of places are really, really wanting to get into that area, but we also want to make sure that they're keeping patient safety first and foremost, and not just making an economic decision, but also making a patient-centric decision. Next slide. Thank you. So another portion that goes into it, of course, is quality. I'm an image reviewer. There are several other image reviewers that take a look at the submitted images for different facilities and different modalities. For the most part, I have found that facilities are providing actually very excellent interpretation, very excellent imaging. It's actually been it's been enjoyable to talk with different facilities about their imaging, their quality, what they do. As you all probably know, radiology is an area filled with nuances. And so it's always great to hear how somebody else might do something and learn from them. And also, again, be able to make suggestions if something isn't quite up to snuff. I enjoy having a conversation with the technologist or the radiologist about how they might be able to improve things, making sure that they understand the need for quality control in terms of patient care, not just image quality, but then also making sure they understand that the different body parts and different anatomy that you can see in the center of the slide, making sure that they're approaching all of those as different exams, not a sort of like with MRI especially. Some places I've seen, very few, but some think that just, sagittal axial coronal T1 and T2 weighted images is all you need for any body part. And as a body imager and as a practicing radiologist, I know for a fact that just isn't true. So it becomes an educational opportunity, which is really enjoyable. I think everybody in the room here enjoys being able to work with the facilities to actually improve patient care, and the facilities very often enjoy doing that as well. So I've been actually very impressed with the image quality, and also with RadSite's ability to continue to encourage good image quality. And next slide. So let me talk about this for a little bit. I have done, and several other people have done audits. We are the first company that was approved by CMS to do virtual audits. There are several different types of audits. There's a desktop audit, a site, virtual and process audit. Of course, if people have questions or they want to know something about their submission for accreditation. We do site visits for accreditation and re-accreditation virtually now. And of course, there are occasional for-cause audits. We actually had very few of those, but they do occur, and we make sure we treat them with all the seriousness that's due for an on-site audit for failure to meet standards. I personally have found that the virtual audits have gone very well. People are enthusiastic. They are happy to show their facility. Typically, the facilities are well run, well maintained. They're following CDC guidelines for social distancing and for COVID, it's been actually wonderful. So the process is that we'll do a virtual audit that will last anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes. I had them show me everything in the facility. I had them show me their procedure manuals and their policy and procedure manuals and their protocol manuals, and show me where the radiologist sits, show me what they do if they have a contrast reaction, whatever the case may be. I have them show me their scheduling region, their waiting room, the outside of their facility, whether or not they have handicap access. Once I'm done with all of that, then we have sort of a Q&A, and I ask them what their opinion is and how we could make it better, because my goal is to always make the auditing process as effective as it needs to be, but not overly onerous. And then lastly, we send my recommendation or the recommendation of the auditors to our accreditation committee. They review the documentation, they review the visit, and they make a decision as to whether or not to accredit the facility. And one of the things I really enjoy is the fact that every time we've done an audit, there's been something new to learn, something new to discuss. Every facility is a little bit different. I personally have found that the audits have been very smooth. The auditees, if that's even a term, the auditees have enjoyed the process. They felt like it was very complete, and overall went very well. Another reviewer actually is Mark Kassner, who I'll pass this on to, but I'd love to know whether Mark has had the same sort of experience in the virtual audits.
And just real quickly, Dr. Browning, I assume there are many instances we've actually provided constructive feedback back to the site we're auditing, and they've made changes because of that audit.
Absolutely right. Yes, I think that that's one of the things I, again, like about RadSite as opposed to other accrediting organizations. I really emphasize the fact that we want to partner with them to make sure they're providing excellent patient imaging. We don't want to simply chastise them for not doing something right and not help them do it better or not answer questions or whatever the case may be. And there have been several times where I've made suggestions regarding one facility, actually one multi-facility organization in the Southwest. They had a policy and procedure manual and a protocol manual, and that rode around in the car with the site manager to several different sites. So my suggestion was it would be pretty easy to just make several copies and just have them at each site. And he just thought that was the best idea. He'd never just thought about the fact that each facility should have its own set of policy and procedures and protocol manuals. So things like that happen occasionally. And I like to provide, and I think the whole team here likes to provide guidance as to how they can reach the level of quality patient care and patient imaging that allows us to accredit them.
Great, thank you, Dr. Browning. So now it's my pleasure to turn over to Mark, who'll talk a little bit about particularly the remote technologist new policy that was approved by CMS, and also kind of his role on the accreditation committee. But Mark, as I said in my introductory comments, has a long history with imaging and other provider groups. So Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gary. And I'm probably going to piggyback on several comments that Patrick just made. One of the things that I think you'll hear as a common theme throughout this webinar is how facile RadSite has been over the years. We don't stand on being static, and I think, you know, as I talk a little bit about remote technology, I think that's part of it, right? So in large part, I think we've seen more virtual everything with the pandemic, and Patrick touched on the virtual audits, and I think remote technology has played into that as well. As I've done a number of audits alongside Dr. Browning, we've noticed more and more that sometimes the radiologist is on site, sometimes they're not. The technologists are always there, but you know, who's overseeing that process? And as Patrick had pointed out, our number one issue always is patient safety, and how can we improve upon that? And again, if you look at the history of RadSite and how often we go back and look at standards, and I'll touch on that as well, because we don't exist in silos here. I work closely with the standards committee. After dealing with some of the accreditation issues, we will go back to the standards committee with concerns that we may have as a committee, and I'll touch upon that in a minute. So if we can flip to the first slide on remote technologists. Thank you. So one of the issues that we found, again, is how do we make sure that we are still following all of the guidelines that we've established? And so one thing we've done now with the remote technologists is they still need to have the same requirements that we'd have if they were operating under normal circumstances. So if they need to be licensed in that particular state, we still require that. Remote technology only currently applies to MR and CT, does not apply to nuclear. But so we want to make sure that they have the proper certifications, et cetera. Typically, the remote technologist is responsible for positioning the patient, making sure that the study, if you will, is good enough to be diagnostic, so that with reviewers like Dr. Browning, some of the other crew that we have, are able to get quality images. Flip again, please. So again, here's some of the qualifications. I don't want to read these slides. I think we've made these available to folks, but again, what you'll notice is that we're focused on the same qualifications, the same certifications throughout, the same training. Garry alluded to before about BLS, ACLS, ARLS certifications. Those same things exist whether you're a remote technologist or a not remote technologist, I guess just technologist. Anyway, so we don't want to skirt around those certifications just because we are operating under a different environment. I think we are all looking forward to getting back to non-remote technologists. I'm not sure that we'll ever fully get there. Every time we think we're getting ahead of the curve, we seem to slide back a little bit. But I think, again, what we're focused on is making sure that the studies that we produce are diagnostic. Next slide. So again, here's some of the personnel requirements. You will find, and Garry showed in the very beginning, our manual. I think it's 140 pages long, Garry, if I recall. It's some light reading for all of you who really want to delve into the qualifications across the board. And this is just one section, obviously, of the things that we focus on. But again, all in all, same requirements across the board for whether you're remote or not. We still want to maintain those standards across the board.
And just a real quick, Mark, as a quick aside, we saw a trend, obviously, of remote technology has been used in part because of the shortage of MRI techs and obviously because of the pandemic. And no one was really talking about this. So RadSite took the lead and queued this up with CMS and the other accreditation organizations to really kind of develop this policy. So this is also will not be stagnant, but represents kind of the requirements to do a proper remote technologist, the supervisor technologist, and then obviously the on-site personnel. So again, it's great that RadSite had our opportunity to kind of facilitate this and kind of capture an emerging trend. And again, it kind of reminds me of my journey with telemedicine. So the healthcare system is changing and we can't keep our head in the sand. And there's actually some feedback that sometimes when you use a specialty technologist, which is required for the supervising technologist, you actually get a better scan or image than you would if you're using a general technologist who's local.
Right. Thanks, Garry. Next slide, please. So I wanted to also take a minute or two to talk about the Accreditation Committee. Again, going back to some of the comments that Garry made in the beginning, these are volunteers that have served. Quite frankly, we've had a very stable crew on the Accreditation Committee that I've chaired for the last 5 or so years. These folks, once a month, we get on, we review all of the applications that Julie and her team have put together, reviewed by folks like Dr. Browning, by Dr. Patton in terms of image quality, whether the physics review is correct. And as I alluded to before, we don't rubber stamp these things. So first of all, they're de-identified centers, so we don't really know where they're coming from. We're more concerned with, did they pass the physics test? Did they pass the image quality test? Did they do all of the administrative issues that we need to cover before we will certify a center? But we go through each one of those applications, and as volume has picked up, I give a lot of credit to the committee. It's a lot of review when we're talking about 25 or 30 different applications every meeting. And then even in between meetings, there are oftentimes additional applications that we are reviewing. The thoroughness of our committee in terms of poking into these things, again, perhaps generates some additional questions and comments that we want to go back to the standards committee in terms of, does age of equipment influence our ability to properly accredit? All the technology settings, et cetera. So we really try to take this very seriously. We're constantly working to evolve those items. And you'll see again, as we continue to update our policies and procedures, in large part, they're based upon some of the things that we've seen throughout the Accreditation Committee. I also want to echo Patrick's comments talking about the virtual audits. I'm not sure how many we've done so far. Patrick and I are doing the majority of them right now. But to a person, they have been extraordinary. I think they've been very appreciative. They're very thorough. People take a lot of pride in their imaging centers. They take a lot of pride in how they do things. Some of the centers I've had the privilege, quite frankly, of talking to, been around 10, 20, 30 years in some cases. And I think, it's just been a very positive experience all the way around. So with that, I think I'll close my portion of it, Garry, and turn it over to Dr. Patton.
Great. Well, Dr. Patton, the floor is yours. Tell us all about physics.
As Garry had stated earlier, I've been with RadSite almost 10 years now, and a lot of things have changed in those 10 years from when we started out trying to set up some standards in physics and image quality, dealing with CMS, trying to get a really robust setting approved to the standards we currently have. And a lot of that change is driven by regulations and overseen by CMS. And some of those changes are driven by the new technology. The technology is constantly changing, and we have to be able to adapt our standards to meet how the technology is changing. And so in our standards, if you look at our regulations, standards 7.2A is CT and 7.2B is one of those new emerging technologies that I'll cover more on the next slide. And that's the cone beam CT. And then 7.4 is our MRI standards, and finally 7.6 is our standards that deal with nuclear medicine, including PET. Well, one of the things that hasn't changed through this time is we require a qualified medical physicist to annually test these modalities. And qualified basically is determined by multiple factors, but one is having a MS in medical physics or a closely related field, being licensed in the state that you practice in if it's required, and you can also be certified by one of the certifying bodies, which is the ABMP, the ABHP, or ACR. And currently our standards for CT, we still look at CT number accuracy, slice thickness verification, CT number uniformity, high and low contrast resolution. We require the physicist to review the CT QC that's being performed by the facility and to meet our standards. The physicist has to look at the dose from the adult head, adult body, peds head, and peds body protocols if they're submitting for both adult and peds. And a physics report has to be submitted to us that was completed within the last 12 months. So what has changed, or what are some of the things that we're looking at? Well, as pediatric protocols are starting to use more and more 80 kVp as their default protocol, we're having to look at how we evaluate those protocols, because 80 kVp CT numbers are very different than 120 kVp CT numbers. So our standards are having to adjust for that if 80 kVp is being utilized, then how do we address that? How do we change our standards to meet that need? The other things that we're looking at, is when we first developed our standards, we had a robust set of phantoms that were able to be used. And we still allow those currently, but approximately 99% of our applicants use the same set of phantoms for CT, and they use the same set of phantoms for MRI. and likewise for nuclear medicine. So we're looking at possibly setting up just one defined phantom so we can be very specific on what our requirements are for that particular phantom for each of the modalities. And that's under investigation still. We haven't made a decision on that, but that's where we're going to be investigating over the next few months. Next slide. I'd mentioned the cone beam CT. If you're not familiar with that, this is really a really booming, emerging area. This modality is really expanded over the last few years, and it's being utilized for dental, it's being utilized for medical extremities, and it's also starting to be utilized for mammography type studies. And as this is being done, we took on the task of setting up standards for it as well, because as mentioned earlier, you have to attack these rising modalities head on and help set the standards so that the facilities are providing what's needed for the patients. So very similar to traditional CT, we have to look at the CT number accuracy, the uniformity of that number. We have to have some type of geometric test, just like for under CT, again, high and low contrast resolution. We require a physics test by a qualified medical physicist, and we evaluate that, and we evaluate the images that come in. But cone beam CT is much more difficult than traditional CT because the phantoms, one, are very different from each vendor. Also, the requirements that each vendor is utilizing or requiring is very different. And so we have to set our standards to adapt for each one of the manufacturers currently. We are looking at trying to find one phantom that can be utilized for all the modalities, and we can actually create a simple set of standards utilizing that phantom. But currently that doesn't really exist to our satisfaction. So our first go at physics testing and physics requirements for cone beam CT relies heavily on the manufacturer's suggested quality control and their suggested values. So as we go forward, we will just continue to improve on that and narrow down the range. But again, it's the same parameters we're looking at. We're also looking at dose. So for all the modalities we looked at, we required them to submit the phantom images, and one of the physicists on our staff will review those images. If there's an issue with the images, like maybe they're not correct images or they just fail, that physicist reaches out to me, and then I reach out to that facility, explain it to them what was not right or what was not to our standard and how they can improve that. And so, as Dr. Browning and Mark also said, that's one of the nice things about RadSite is that it's an educational process. So we don't immediately fail them. We put them in a corrective action status and try to educate them on what we're looking for and how they can actually improve their images and get accredited through us. So we do it both clinically and we do it on the physics side. MRI, some of the changes we made in the MRI is we used to evaluate just the site T1 and T2 images from the facility, but a lot of that we've noticed are very specialized site 1 and site 2 images, and they did not translate well to phantom acquisitions. So now with CMS approval, not only do we look at the site 1 and site 2 and see if they pass, but we also have 2 defined protocols that are more appropriate for phantom acquisitions in case their sites do not pass. And that's a T1 and that's a dual echo T2. These were our protocols that CMS has approved in the past. They approved for us as well. So most physicists are familiar with those protocols. So now we actually require 5 sets of images for MRI physics. And so we can evaluate 3 of them at a time. And that increases the probability the facility is going to pass on the first go around. It kind of reduces the headache. And that's spelled out real well in our standards. So, you know, if there's any questions on that, that can be found pretty easily. That's in the 7.4. But again, that is because as we've been in this area and been working on accreditation and seen the modalities change, and in particular, some of the T1 and T2 protocols are becoming more and more specialized, we wanted to have an opportunity for the facility to present something that's well suited for the Phantom, can pass on the first go around. Nuclear medicine and both planar and spec, and then PET, those that's a very old modality, but those are old modalities, been utilized for years, and the standards really haven't changed much on our end. We have narrowed down some parameters, but in general, they have stayed the same. But we're constantly investigating those as well to see where we want to go with our standards. Things that have changed are some of the mobile nuclear medicine cameras. They have slightly changed the way they do acquisitions and what the manufacturer suggests for some of the QC. So we're having to look at what our QC requirements are there to see how we're going to adapt and make the change to these manufacturers. But in general, I think we've done a very good job at being able to look at the facilities, how they want to apply to us, what type of standards CMS is requiring, and how those standards have kind of been really specified and narrowed down over the last 10 years. And we've been able to communicate that with the facilities and work with the physicists or the facility to get them through the accreditation process with as little headache as possible. Again, as Dr. Browning said, our job is not to go out there and chastise a facility. Our job is to work with a facility to provide the best quality images for the patient. And I think we do that quite well. Okay, with that, I think that's really all I have about physics. The rest is really just kind of getting in the weeds, and I don't think it's appropriate for this presentation. So I'll turn it over to Julie.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Patton. Julie.
Sorry, forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. Thank you very much. So now we're going to really get into the whole bones of the structure, because everybody wants to know about the accreditation process. It says review process here, but before you get to the review, the first step is you have to do the application. So I always tell everybody the first step of doing the application is reading the standards. So make sure you read the standards so you know all about what's required. The second step is to review our portal tutorial so that you understand the steps that you'll be taking once you get into the portal. Usually if you talk to us ahead of time, we send you those. We also send you the 2 agreements and a document checklist. So those are the key documents, resources that you need. They are also available in the portal. So once you do get going with the process, there are 3 parts to an application. The first part, of course, is answering all the questions, uploading the required documents, and then the next part is going in and uploading your images and the reports. And then the last part is uploading the physics phantoms and the physics report. And as Dr. Patton said, that report should have been taken in the last year. So because it is an annual report that we're looking at. So once you get through the application and submit that to us, Of course, we review it, do a quick review, make sure all the pieces are there, and then it gets assigned out to the reviewers. And as both Dr. Browning and Dr. Patton said, once the reviewer does a review, if they've got any questions, we get back in touch with the applicant in order to let them review the issue and make any appropriate changes that they feel necessary. This also happens with the desktop review. If there's questions that our admin reviewer has about your application, documents aren't what she's looking for, things like that, we do get back in touch with you and give you that opportunity to review it and make any necessary changes. And it may mean that you have to make changes, to your process before you can make the changes in our thing. And we're hoping that this give and take is, helping to make the facility a better organization. Once all 3 reviewers have returned their passing reports, as Mark Kassner said, the application is then put into an executive summary where it is de-identified. We use only the application number, and then of course the Accreditation Committee has no idea who that application number belongs to, and they then do their review, any questions they might have, and as Mark said, they do, they don't want to be a rubber stamp. They want to make sure that, the reviewers have done their jobs and that the application is worthy of becoming accredited by RadSite. And so we go from there. The next step in here, of course, is there's an appeals process. So because we work with you with the application, we're good about, making those fixes ahead of time, but there are times where things change, and that's where the virtual audits, the on-site audit, the for cause audit all come into place, and, because things can happen. So we do have those appeals process in place if they're needed. And as all the men in front of me, Dr. Browning, Dr. Patton, Mark Casner, and Garry all said, our goal is to give that meaningful backup to, get a communication going with you to help you become a better organization. And we've seen that with a lot of small organizations, doctors' offices, where they've never written anything down and now they have to. So it makes them a better organization. Next slide. So in the RadSite portal, you can see it's the different pieces there. I'll talk about a couple. The Streamline accreditation process. We do follow the standards pretty well in that application, and that's why I stress reading the standards first so that you know what is expected of you. One of the things that we've done in helping to streamline that is to provide a copy function that's new. So if you have done an application in the past, especially in this version, you would be able to copy those answers into the new application. I highly stress that if you use this copy function, that you verify the answers. A lot of them probably will be what you would have answered, as you went through, but sometimes there aren't, and so therefore you need to really review and verify those answers that you've copied. We are cloud hosted, and then the next piece is the user permissions. We do ask everybody to create a user account. And for most applicants, it's one person going in and working on that application. If there is more than one person, we highly recommend that you don't share that login, that each person creates their own user account, and then we can attach multiple users to a facility that allows them to see those applications. All right, there's an online document library. And of course, the next step, which is integral, is that Ambra Health DICOM image upload system. We have recently done some tweaks to it so that the applicant now can view their studies that they've uploaded. They are also able to, if they missed uploading the report, when they click on the view of the studies, they can upload that report and that sort of thing. So a lot of folks are finding that very, very helpful. Enterprise solution integration, that is one that we've started for some of our very large organizations so that they can give us such as like corporate documents. And so when they create the application, they've already uploaded most of the corporate documents, so then they only have to do specific documents, usually the credentials that are specific to the site. So there's a few other advantages if you've got many sites, but give us a call. We can talk to you about that and go from there. A secure backup, we do have that as well. So this slide talks about our webinars, our press releases, blogs, and other publications. You can find all of this on our website. This webinar, as was stated at the very beginning, is being recorded, and it will, in the next day or so, switch from register now to a recorded webinar where you would be able to go in and listen to it again or tell somebody else about it so that they could listen to it. We also have for the last couple of years other recorded webinars. If you're interested in the Cone Beam CT, we did a series last year of 3 webinars, and so they're very informative. And we just recently did a webinar with Christine Taxon about the claims and that sort of thing. So, very good information to be able to go in and download. Also, there are press releases and our blogs and other publications. Gary, do you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, that's good. I know we've run over a little bit, so we'll make a few quick comments about future trends, and then we can wrap it up. If you do have questions, I think regarding today's webinar, please send them to info@radsitequality.com, and we'll make sure we answer all those questions. But thank you to all the speakers today. I mean, clearly I think a couple of times was said today that we're not in a static field, and there's emerging trends with imaging modalities. There's a reference to Cone Beam CT, perhaps breast. There's development of new standards. Things are changing, not only for diagnostic, but for therapeutics. There's the role of expanding outcome metrics, such as the KIBA potential initiative. There's a movement towards integrating care. As I mentioned earlier, the move towards telemedicine, the application of artificial intelligence to enhance and perhaps replace some existing workflows, and the innovation of the precision medicine with DNA sequencing and CRISPR technology, et cetera. Let me just start off real quickly with Dr. Browning. I know you've been thinking a little bit about AI. Any kind of initial thoughts or observations?
Yeah, I think AI honestly is the future. I think that some radiologists may think that it's going to eventually replace them. I think that it's actually going to end up being an important tool in the day-to-day business as we try and accomplish more volume, and we want better outcomes and higher value reports. So I think that AI is definitely in the future, and I'm glad that we're keeping our eye on it so we can actually begin to provide some great options regarding accreditation and accuracy of AI rather than the many claims that are made about AI now.
Yeah, it's interesting from RadSite's perspective. There really are over a dozen different new accreditation programs that we could develop. One of the things I enjoyed about my first CEO, accreditation organization I served at was you grew from 2 accreditation programs to 17 over the course of 9 years. So I think RadSite does stand ready to provide some supplemental standards and accreditation programs for emerging trends. Mark, Dr. Patton, any additional thoughts in terms of future trends? I think there's obviously a lot going on here.
Yeah, I would just again reiterate that this is a change in environment. Healthcare is a change in environment. We think about, again, the impact of the pandemic, how quickly we were able to get a vaccine developed. And I think one of the strengths of RadSite over the years has been its ability to stay on the leading edge, if you will, not the bleeding edge of the technology that's out there, continue to develop standards, refine standards, add new technologies to make this a better experience overall. And again, not to de-emphasize our impact on patient safety.
Great, thanks, Mark. Dr. Patton?
Well, I think we covered a lot of this. One, I think, like I said, with CBCT is definitely an expanding modality that is only going to grow exponentially as the size of the machine is smaller. The technology, the engineering and physics is rapidly advancing, and so this modality is just destined to grow, and we need to stay on top of the regulations for them and creating standards for them.
Great, thanks, Dr. Patton. So Julie, let me hand it back over to you to kind of wrap up. Again, just a reminder, if you have any questions since we ran over, please send them to info@radsitequality.com. We'll definitely turn those around right away. But Julie, the floor is yours.
The next slide. There you go. And just in closing, I just want to remind everyone that today's presentation has been recorded and all registered participants will receive an email with a link to it by the end of the week. It will also be available on our website. And if you enjoyed this presentation, there is one more webinar scheduled in the fall series, promoting the patient experience through the integration of leadership values, a spotlight on outpatient imaging centers featuring David J. Waldron, CEO of Traction Business Development. And this will be on Wednesday, December the 8th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern. Don't forget to check out the webinar page on our website for past webinar recordings. If you missed one or would like to hear one again, you can always download the recording. We hope you will continue to join us for the December webinar and others when they are scheduled. Thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.